We're continuing in our series on church pictures, images of the church. So, what makes an image in our imagination memorable? What makes a moment memorable? Like, what makes us enjoy one experience but not another? Is it our emotions? So I'm just asking some simple questions to think about. I mean, some of you have studied and you can tell me what makes a memorable experience, but just for all of us to be thinking, is it your emotions, your attitude, our beliefs and ideas that shape us? Say, okay, this is what I really like. Is it because we anticipate and we're ready? Or is it the adrenaline of a surprise that makes us either really enjoy it or really dislike it? Memories are attached to our cognitive processes, the way that we think, the way that our brain processes it. Memories, they tell us, are also attached to our senses. All of our five senses, our sight, our smell, sound, taste, touch. So, I hope that this hour here is a memorable moment for you, particularly as we talk about and participate in a communion service. I hope and I invite you to be present with all of your senses. Something Lisa and I are learning and tell each other, look, she was up in a retreat this weekend. I said, just be present with all of your senses. I mean, just try to be aware, try to just be there. And I'm the kind of person, I like to be sitting here and my brain is off somewhere else. And my emotions are probably disconnected and I'm just like, I could be anywhere. And I'm like, what are we talking about? What are we doing? And that's not really good for a marriage relationship, in case you were wondering. But I want us to, as we're present with our senses, and for you to participate, if you're willing, and also to understand why a communion service is meaningful and relevant for our life today. So to start, we're going to practice a little skill. It's a life skill that we work on, and it's sitting in silence. And sitting in silence with a goal of learning to be more fully present, more fully aware, and able to bring our focus to this particular time and place. Now, silence is not easy. If you've tried to be still, some of you find it easier than others, but for most people, silence is not easy. And so are you ready to take the challenge? Last week, Nate ended his message, his talk, and he says, okay, we'll just take a few minutes to reflect in silence. Well, I stood up and talked. I thought what I said was important, but a few people mentioned to me afterwards, you didn't give us the time in silence. And that would have been good. And so, that's right. I can't go back and reverse that moment, but I can give us an extra way to practice silence. So some friends in New York made a video. They just asked a few people about their practice of silence, people that are actually in the emotionally healthy relationships course and are practicing silence. And they're all from New York, so they talk really fast. So we're going to watch the video twice. It's in English, and you'll hear different kinds of accents. And then we're going to hear the words are written in Spanish. And one of our members of our community did that for us. It worked really hard, and it's great, but it's so fast. If you're just watching in Spanish, I'll just hope you can catch it, and later we'll send it out to you. You can watch it again. And if you can't, don't stress, just be still. After we watch it, we'll take 2 minutes of silence. So I'll tell you, when you practice silence, just sit down and make sure you're comfortable. Maybe put your feet on the floor, but sit however so you can just say, okay, I'm relaxed, I'm comfortable. And take some deep, slow breaths, and realize, am I taking a good breath? And then notice maybe how different parts of your body feel. Say, my foot hurts. I didn't realize. I'm kind of uncomfortable. I don't like the chair. My head hurts. Or I feel great. And then just look carefully at something and notice the details. Maybe you never noticed something up here, or study the window or whatever. Look at something and just observe. And just give God thanks for the privilege to be here, present. Okay? Let's watch the video.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us. We will have one of our customers.
Market rose today after Red Chair
Silence it's a muscle you have to develop. It's a fundamental block that we somehow miss because of the busyness and the noise of this world that we live in.
My family growing up was not silence, it was violence. And you wanted to escape the house. I got to get out of here, this is crazy.
Between the downward spiral of things happening in my life, my silence was driven by depression.
Sitting silent for 30 seconds was extremely difficult. I could not stop my mind from wandering from one to-do list to the next.
Silence is a challenge, and it still is a challenge. You know, I may have had a challenging day, and so my thoughts are wavering all over the place. I am too distracted.
With Christ it was really kind of like faith by works, just serving. I never confessed the things that I confessed to God during my silence. I never made that connection.
I could hear God in the silence. And that wasn't just in my relationship with God. It's something that now it affected all my relationships.
I think the real strength of rest and Sabbath and silence is that you learn to accept your limitations as a person. In the moments that you are silent, that you are not working, God is still capable to accomplish his goals. God was more concerned with me, not with what I was doing for him, but whether or not I was with him.
With silence and solitude, it was more of a relationship. It was less about me and more about God and Christ and his voice and what he's saying to me at that moment.
I found when I got alone with God and just was with him, that slowed me down enough to where I could recognize these actions in my life, where I can control them now.
Now I have a silence that drives me back to who he is and how I can be uplifted, in a way. And that is the greatest feeling. I can't imagine a life without pausing and centering myself.
The daily office gives you a system by which you could really reflect, meditate, pray, and start building that relationship with the Lord.
So, if you don't remember anything else today, remember the silence and ask somebody else or tell somebody else how you experienced it. So once upon a time, there was a shepherd boy, a young shepherd boy. He was the youngest brother, and he surprised everybody by becoming a mighty warrior and eventually a famous king. King David, they called him. In fact, he is remembered as the greatest king of ancient Israel. When David was a boy, he learned to fight some wild animals in order to protect his sheep, but also to sit in silence. He composed poems and prayers. He played beautiful music on simple instruments. He was famous. He became famous as a musician and as a songwriter. His creative genius flowed from his heart, full of praise, prayers, and problems. He was the king during the golden age of Israel. He was raised in relative poverty and silence. He was brought into the palace of the king, where he discovered fame and success. But some of his choices in life brought great tragedy to his family and his friends. He almost came to ruin. But he allowed God to speak into his life, and he finished well. David was very real, and he wrote songs that he wanted people to remember. If you listen to the Psalms, the book of Psalms in your Old Testament, if you listen as you read them out loud, you can feel the passion, the pain, the wonder, the praise, the confusion, even as you hear words and phrases that have been passed down to us, and we wonder about some of their meaning, but they've been passed down to us across the centuries. He is most remembered for killing Goliath and for the 23rd Psalm, where he said, "The Lord is my shepherd." And you know that psalm. Now picture David choosing the words that he will use to begin a psalm. David, at one time in his life, was a fugitive, hiding from his enemies. Now, I should tell you, I'm going to say something about David and something about Moses and something about Jesus. And they have some things in common, and it's going to bring us to communion. But David, at one time, he's a fugitive. He's hiding from his enemies. He's facing tragedies, temptations, and many difficult trials. So he found strength in the life and the memory of Moses. Moses, who lived at least 500 years before David. Often, David's psalms refer back to the Exodus, that dramatic story of how Moses led the people out of Egypt. Now, if you're reading the Psalms, you study the Psalms, you just look through it, you might come to notice that there are 5 different major sections, like 5 different books. It's almost like a little collection of books put together for us and are put together for somebody else, and then we have a copy as well. So these 5 different books, and each book has its own theme. The section number 2, which is about Psalm 42 to Psalm 72, the theme is the Exodus, or it's part of the images come from the Exodus. It's mostly written by King David. He did not write all of the Psalms, but he wrote many of them, and he wrote most of them, and he wrote most of the Psalms in book 2, like Psalm 42 to 72, with images from the Exodus. Now, the Exodus is a story of ruined lives, people in slavery, that were restored by the goodness, the power, and the provision of God. So David reminds us of Moses. Now, Moses was born secretly and in poverty as the son of Hebrew slaves. The daughter of the Pharaoh, most of you probably, maybe all of you know the story of Moses. So you're like, yeah, I know that, get to the point. So I'm saying some of the things to just remind you, think of the images. You know, Moses hidden in the basket down by the river. And the daughter of the Pharaoh discovering him, adopting him. Moses rose to fame and power. Some historians believe that he was the general of the Egyptian army. But he fell into ruin and exile. As an older man, a shepherd in the wilderness, Moses met God in a supernatural encounter. He was restored and renewed. He returned to Egypt. He confronted the Pharaoh, and he eventually led the entire community of slaves that historians and students put somewhere between 600,000 and maybe 1.5 million people out of Egypt and into a whole new destiny. Moses is remembered as a nation builder, as the lawgiver. He is among the greatest leaders the world has ever seen. He put together the Torah, the 5 books of the law, the first 5 books of your Old Testament that are the very heart and center of the Hebrew Scriptures and the Jewish faith. Moses was known to be a prophet. In godly play, they say that means he came so close to God, and God came so close to him that Moses knew what God was saying to the people. Moses connected the people with God many times in many places, but most memorably at Mount Sinai. And together, the people of Israel affirmed a covenant. They became a family, a nation, a community, and they affirmed a covenant for all time. It was a pledge and a promise. all of life would now be lived in light of their new commitment to receive God's grace and presence in order to share His light and love with the world. Everyone there was invited. There were the Hebrew people and all the foreigners among them. Foreigners was what they called the people that weren't the Hebrews, because the Hebrews were writing about their people. So everybody was invited. It was a covenant in the ancient tradition that was larger than just the Hebrew way, the ancient tradition of cutting the covenant with blood. And so this blood made it real. The blood meant that it was life and death. You were fully committed to God, and God was fully committed to you. Moses sprinkled the people symbolically with blood. Like sometimes people sprinkle holy water. And he sprinkled the blood at the people, over the people. And they made a feast of food that lasted until everyone had been served all that they could enjoy. Now Moses failed in his life for a time. But by God's grace, his life and leadership were restored. The things that he said and did in the final years of his life are still talked about today and celebrated in many ways. If you have a Bible, as I didn't put it on the screen, or you can look it up later, but Psalm 68, right near the end of that section too, Psalm 68 starts off, the whole psalm is interesting, but I'm going to just read the first few verses. Psalm 68, verse 1. May God arise, and may his enemies be scattered. May his foes flee before him. So that's a declaration from David, but it's actually a quote from Moses. May God arise, and may his enemies be scattered. May his foes flee before him. You know, Moses wrote in his journal, I suppose, because later he put it together, and in the book of Numbers, we find out that Moses, at one point in the journey through the desert, got up in the morning and he said that every day to start the day. As he got up and he looked at the sun, or he looked at the path, or he looked at the people, I don't know where he was looking, or if he was by himself with a cup of coffee and whatever he did to start his day, he said every day, may God arise, may his enemies be scattered, may his foes flee before him. It's a phrase of hope. It's a wish. And so here's his wish in verse 2 and 3. May you blow them away like smoke. And the smoke goes. As wax melts before the fire, may the wicked perish before God. But may the righteous be glad and rejoice before God. May they be happy and joyful. Can you imagine that Moses' goal in the morning was the same as David's goal and your goal? Whose goal? Everybody's goal. May our enemies just disappear. My brain problems, my work problems, my neighbors that are problems, whoever's a problem could have just go away so that I could rejoice and just be happy and joyful. That's verse 3. And so then he gives some wise counsel to be able to achieve that. Sing to God, sing the praise of his name. Praise him who rides on the clouds. And some translations translate that, and it's a whole thing about Hebrew I'll have to explain. They translate that, he who rides in the desert. So riding in the desert as the Lord of the desert coming across on his camel, I guess, or riding in the clouds, a chariot. And so the idea of this is God who masters nature. Rejoice, his name is the Lord. And all that stuff about the enemies, listen to what David writes. God is a father to the fatherless. He's a defender of widows. That's who God is in his holy dwelling. God sets the lonely in families. He leads out the prisoners with singing, but the rebellious live in a sun-scorched land. That's who the people of Israel were. They were the fatherless, the widows, the orphans, the poor, the oppressed. They were slaves. and they were led out with singing. But because of their rebellion, they were living in the sun-scorched lands. So what an interesting thing to think about Moses. And to think that 500 years later, David is remembering the words of Moses. And so if you can go in your mind forward another 1,000 years, and the people still are reading this psalm and remembering these words, and every time, may God arise, may his enemies be scattered, and you can picture Moses on the mountain leading the people, defeating the Pharaoh, or David conquering his enemies and creating the golden kingdom, and the great times coming for the people of God. In the times of Jesus, everybody knew these stories. These stories were national treasures. In fact, today, in our world, all these 2,000 years after Jesus, people are still traveling around to see artwork and statues of Moses and David. And so every Jewish man and woman understood the concept of covenant, a commitment by faith to trust God and be his representative in the world. Everyone that followed Jesus or fought with Jesus was thinking of the covenant and how to defend their faith. Some, like Peter, James, and John, believed that Jesus was a descendant of King David, uniquely sent by God to restore the nation of Israel to another golden age. So they were excited. They were with him. They were behind him. Others, like Judas, felt that Jesus was powerful, but he needed some kind of a push to get this revolution going. Judas wanted God, through Jesus, to rise up and scatter the enemies. But he seemed to forget the second rest of that psalm, which indicated that Moses was really talking about how can we find peace and purpose in the journey, trust God for our enemies, and we want to rejoice and be happy and do the right things. And gather together the poor, the lonely, the widow, the orphan into a family, a community of faith. Now, Jesus, we've been talking about through this series, was building a community, a family, a church building where each person is like a living stone. So with the words of King David in your mind, and this memory of the Exodus, particularly if you're familiar with the story, the memory in your imagination, consider again the meaning and purpose of communion. There they were celebrating the solemn Passover ceremony. Now the Passover had come before Moses on Mount Sinai, but it has all this tremendous imagery too. And it was not the covenant, but it was the blood and the sacrifice and all this thing that happened, and the people of Israel were celebrating a solemn meal to always remember. Eat this in remembrance of the Passover. And so there they were. And as they ate the bread that had the meaning, and as they drank from the cups and the series of cups that they had, each one with its significance, Jesus, the very night that he's betrayed, he takes the bread and he breaks it. And remember what they are remembering. And he gives it to them and he says, "This is my body broken for you." Wait, that's the Passover bread. No, this is my body broken for you. Eat this in remembrance of me. I bet they had a few seconds of silence. I mean, these guys, nobody had ever spoken words like that before. And to us, it's like something the pastor says or the priest says. In remembrance of me. And after they had eaten, Judas had already slipped away into the night Well, he was there. He's going to slip away into the night. Judas is still there present with them. And Jesus took the cup and he offered it to them. He blessed it, or he gave thanks. And he said, drink from this, all of you, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, the new covenant. Another period of silence. Like, what is this guy talking about? Which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. But isn't God to rise up and scatter the enemies? Isn't that what this is all about? Restore the kingdom? The power of God? Jesus finally is going to be revealed. I mean, this guy raises the dead, he heals the lepers, he feeds the multitudes, he can do anything. He calmed the storms. He's pretty much proven that he is like, he's channeling God. He says he's God. He says, if you've seen the Father, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And now he says the Passover, the covenant, is about him. Eat this, drink this in remembrance of me.